Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.
Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the VIDC to our panel discussion about current regional migration trends and European responses. Probieren wir es mit einem und direkt? Yes, okay. Okay, anyway, just a general welcome remarks. But more important, especially I would like to welcome our speakers on the panel, Olivia Akumu, Alida Vracic, and Gerald Knaus. Thank you very much for coming to Vienna and joining our discussion. Our speakers will be later on properly introduced by our moderator. At this point, I would like to thank Stephanie Fenkart from the IIP for not only for the moderation of this evening, but also for the good cooperation in preparing this event. Furthermore, our thanks go to the Austrian Development Agency for their financial support, and to my colleagues from the VIDC for their assistance in organizing tonight. Some organizational remarks. The discussion of tonight will be held in English. It will last until 9 o'clock, and afterwards you're invited for some small refreshments, and you have the chance for some informal talks or networking. You will find on your chairs the feedback questionnaires. Please make use of them and give us your comments about the event. Leave them afterwards at the chairs or deposit them outside on the information desk. Why we have organized this event? I guess most of you know the dramatic reports or pictures from the Greek islands. The unhuman living conditions on the Greek islands, in the camps, but also in Bosnian refugee camps, are not acceptable. The European Treaty of Lisbon states in Article 2, the Union is founded on the values of respect, of human dignity and human rights. And therefore, I would like to ask, who has the responsibility for this violation of the treaty? But tonight we would like to go further. We also look beyond European borders, because dynamics and trends in other regions will or might affect also Europe. In Idlib, the current offensive by the Syrian regime caused the biggest single exodus of refugees in the Syrian war. Up to 700,000 people, others say 900,000 people, are forced to be on the move. Furthermore, we would like to look to regions which are, let's say, out of our media coverage, like East Africa. According to UNHCR, there are 5 million refugees or 4.5 million refugees and much more IDPs, internal displaced people, to be accommodated by the countries in East Africa. So everywhere from the Greek islands to Idlib to East Africa, in all the camps and settlements, there is a lack of basic services such as food and shelter, clean water and sanitation, education and healthcare. And therefore, we also demand that countries like Austria will increase their meager contributions to the affected countries and international organizations to scope these catastrophes, and to participate actively in resettlement programs. And last but not least, on the policy level, the EU institutions need to enter what I would call a new migration dialogue with these neighboring regions, which respects not only our self-interest, but also the realities and the trends in these countries of origin, countries of transit. How such dialogues and plans could be designed, I hope this will be also a part of our discussion of tonight. For example, the ongoing post-Cotonou negotiations between the European Union and the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, also the new announced EU-Africa strategy would be possibilities to include such a fair dialogue, hosting both the interests of the countries of origin, transit, and also destination. Okay, but now it's time to hand over to our moderator. Stephanie Fenkart is, as I said already, director at the International Institute for Peace since 2016. And the IIP conducts peace and research and promotes non-violent conflict resolutions in different parts of the world. I wish you an interesting and also hopefully inspiring evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franz. Thank you very much, Franz. Welcome, everybody. It is my turn now to lead the discussion, and I would like to start with a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm very happy that so many of you came tonight, even though we have this coronavirus excitement at the moment. So thank you very much for coming still, nevertheless, and to talk and to discuss with us about, I would say, very, very important topics. I will go to introduce our panelists in a second, but maybe also adding to what Franz already said. I think it's not news that Europe and the European Union and also its political leaders since 2015, when we had this big influx of refugees and migrants into the European Union, seems quite to be literally obsessed with the topic of migration. It comes up on literally every newspaper. Migration is one of the hot topics since 2015, even though the numbers have been going down. And I think it is very important, and we will hear later, I think, from Olivia as well, and also from Gerald, also some facts and figures. And it is important that we also look at the facts and figures, that we analyze them, and that we then draw conclusions out of it. I would also like to thank, of course, the VIDC for the very good cooperation. I think for us as institutes, it's very important that we cooperate on these topics, that we work together, that we combine our efforts in organizing joint events, joint conferences, joint policy ideas. So thank you very much to the VIDC, and thank you very much, Franz Schmidjell, of course, for your big support in organizing and in promoting this event. I would like to start with the topic of this evening, because it's called Fortress Europe, Current Migration Trends and European Responses. This is what we're going to talk about, and also, as Franz already mentioned, we talk about the neighborhood, we will talk about the situation in the Western Balkans, how it is approached, how it is perceived in Europe, but we will also talk about Eastern Africa, which is quite different than also then again from Western Africa. Africa is not Africa, and very much look forward to the discussion. What are the current migration trends and how do they affect Europe? What is the human price that migrants and refugees are paying within Africa already when they are going towards the Mediterranean, in the Libyan detention centers? We heard about the devastating situation, but also already on the road there. And then on the other hand, we have the Western Balkans, the situation there, and the Greek islands, but also in Bihać in Bosnia. We heard about pushbacks from Croatia, European Union country. So I would say many developments still recently happening and affecting Europe. The interesting question in the end would also be like, how could a win-win situation look like for the sending and the receiving countries? And I really hope that we can also talk about this issue afterwards. Maybe for the procedure, I will start with Olivia. She will then give you like a very short remark. She will show you some facts and figures, what is important in Eastern Africa, what is she working, what are the challenges, what are the prospects. I will then turn to Alida. She will then more cover the Western Balkans, which is And a different thing than Eastern Africa. She will also talk about migration, a different narrative of migration, or how we could and should maybe create a different narrative on migration. And then, of course, Gerda Knaus will hopefully then talk also a little bit about the policy level. And I look forward then to give the floor to you, and we're going to have a discussion with you, a Q&A session. And I look forward to a very interesting evening, and I hope you're also going to enjoy it. To introduce the lady on my right, her name is Olivia Akumu. She's an analyst at the Mixed Migration Center for East Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. She's a humanitarian researcher and a project manager with a background in humanitarian crisis, displacement and migration in the Horn of Africa and in Yemen. She came all the way from Kenya, so thank you very much for coming and joining us, and I hope you're also going to look forward to this interesting event. Maybe just to start already, you can share us, you brought some slides, you can share us some regional migration trends, some basic facts and figures. What are the political narratives maybe also concerning migration in the region, in Africa, in Eastern Africa? What is the perception there? Like probably also from the leadership, but then also from the people. I would say maybe up to 10 minutes. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. As been presented, my name's Olivia from the Mixed Migration Center, the Eastern Africa Hub. Just by way of introduction, MMC Mixed Migration Center is one of 7 hubs globally that is looking at mixed migration trends, data analysis, research within different regions. So East Africa Hub is one, and the oldest one, actually the genesis of MMC globally. We have hubs in North Africa, West Africa, Europe, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, and a central unit in Geneva that coordinates all our efforts. Our efforts are basically centered around 3 pillars, the first of which being building knowledge and really some nuance to the mixed migration discourse. Second, to look at evidence and to build evidence that will hopefully support policy and development of policies within the region, and thirdly, also to provide an evidence base for practitioners in terms of programming. We are a part of the Danish Refugee Council. We're completely integrated, although we have a slightly different brand. We're not just a service for the DRC, we're a service, we like to put ourselves as a service for the sector in terms of the 3 pillars that I've outlined just now. So my presentation will be generally an overview of statistics and trends, looking at movements from, through, and to Eastern Africa, and then a little bit on the points that Stephanie has touched on there. So by way of definition, it's a little bit long, I'm not going to read it all out, but this is how the Mixed Migration Center defines mixed migration. I think different organizations use different terminologies, mixed movements, mixed flows. This is the definition that we like to use. Essentially, it is recognizing that one, the baseline is that there are cross-border movements of people. Second, that people are moving for a multiplicity of factors. Not just one reason for movement, but often a confluence of different factors that come together and somebody then makes a decision to move. We understand, of course, that people in these mixed flows often have different legal statuses, and that then exposes them to particular vulnerabilities while they're on the move. But generally speaking, we're talking about people that are often using similar means of travel, traveling along similar routes, and often traveling irregularly and wholly or partially assisted by smugglers. So the region, Eastern Africa, is defined in very many various ways. Sometimes it's a little bit bigger in terms of the scope, sometimes it's a little bit narrower. I've got a map on the screen that looks at what is generally categorized as Greater Eastern Africa and also touches on a few of Great Lakes states. But if you look at those countries in question, at the end of September, UNHCR said that there were 4.5 million asylum seekers and refugees within the region. 59% of these were below 18 years old. And once you put together people that are under 18 and also children, women, then that figure shoots up to 81%. So 81% of people who are displaced within the region are women and children. Of course, with the vulnerabilities that come with being displaced, and also the specific needs and vulnerabilities that affect women and children. In terms of countries of origin, where are these people coming from, these huge numbers? The biggest countries are South Sudan and DRC, but there's also quite a big cohort of, for example, Somali refugees within the region over the last couple of decades. But that's just asylum seekers and refugees. Once you start to add on top of that IDPs, people that are internally displaced within their own countries, we're talking even higher than asylum seekers and refugees. 5.2 million was the estimate by IDMC at the end of 2018. And so we're talking about 9.7 million people forced to move and being hosted within the region. So these numbers are quite big. When we look at migration from the region, for us, we're interested in three major routes. I've got them on screen there. The eastern route, these geographical terms are in relation to Eastern Africa. So east from the region heading towards Saudi Arabia and Gulf states via Yemen. The southern route down towards Southern Africa, South Africa in particular, and the northern route towards Northern Africa, Egypt, Libya, and then movement also across the Mediterranean into Europe. And when we talk about the major nationalities on these different routes, it varies depending on the route, but largely we're talking about Eritreans, Ethiopians, and Somalis. And I want to go into a little bit of a breakdown of the numbers and factors along these routes later on. According to IOM's DTM program, it's a displacement tracking matrix. That's what the DTM stands for. The end of 2018, intra-regional movement, whether it was to countries within the region or movement within the region that would eventually lead to movement there out, 832,000 people at least at the end of 2018. And mid-year figures for 2019 were around 329,000. So on par to get close to, if not hit the same figure that we had in 2018. So the scale of movement is quite remarkable. Having a look then at the eastern route. The eastern route is one that I think a lot of people don't really know about unless you are working on migration within the region. You might also be working in the humanitarian sector in the region, but you might not understand these figures a little bit more unless you're specifically focused on migration. The eastern route is very important when we're looking at mixed migration because it actually accounts for the largest movement of migrants from Eastern Africa, leave alone the southern route, leave alone the northern route. It's really the eastern route. So the end of 2019, at least 138,000 people arrived on the shores of Yemen with an intention, most, to travel through Yemen, through the conflict, through the air bombings, through the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen, to head to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, typically to look for work and employment in those countries. When you break that down, that's around 11,000 people per month traveling along this route. Largely male, around 70% of arrivals in Yemen on this route are male, and almost exclusively Ethiopians, around 90% Ethiopians and the remaining proportion Somalis. As I said, most people traveling along this route intending to go to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, a smaller proportion, around 10 to 12%, intending to stay within Yemen itself. Departure points in the region, and I hope the map is at least somewhat clear. Djibouti is a big transit point, or exit point for the region, across the Gulf of Aden, and also the Basaso in Puntland, Somalia, being another departure point. 138,000, I think, is a bit of a conservative figure. In fact, when you look at how these numbers are counted, it's basically monitoring points and data collectors, enumerators that are stationed on the Yemeni coast that are kind of counting and trying to put some estimation in terms of the numbers that are arriving on a daily basis. Access, of course, with the situation in Yemen means that the coverage that we had some years back isn't as wide as it was before, so we can only assume that actually 138,000 is a conservative estimate. And there are some figures floating around saying that actually 1,000 people per day could be crossing from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. So if you look at those two figures, I guess the truth is somewhere in between, but nonetheless, the numbers are quite remarkable. The second figure that I've got on there, 340,000, is actually looking at returns from Saudi Arabia back to Ethiopia. So Saudi Arabia periodically has a a government policy that they put out to try and crack down on irregular, undocumented migration into the country. And after giving some kind of an amnesty period, it then goes on to deport migrants from the country back to countries of origin. So the figure 340,000 is Ethiopians that were deported between the end of 2017 up until the end of 2019. So there's a bit of a bidirectional flow that's happening there in terms of migrants heading to Saudi Arabia and also coming back. Year on year, these figures seem to rise. This year seems to have taken a slight dip, but we have had figures as high as 160,000 in recent years. And as I say, all of these figures are an at least. The southern route towards South Africa, so that's transiting through Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and the countries all the way down mainly to South Africa itself. We tried to put an estimate on this figure in 2017. There isn't much tracking that's happening on this route in terms of being able to count, but we place it at around 13 to 14,000 people on a conservative side, somewhere a little bit higher maybe to about 16,000 if we're to factor in some variables. Movements along this route actually are predominantly Somali nationals. So around 80% of these arrivals in South Africa are Somalis, and then a small proportion, 20% of Ethiopians. And then the number that I guess is most important for discussions in Europe, the movements on the northern route. I don't have an exact figure on there, and you can see I've put percentages because I just really want us to, rather than focus on the numbers really for the northern route, just to look at the change that has happened over a few years. So at the height of arrivals in Europe, end of 2016, when the numbers were at quote-unquote crisis point, we were talking about 22% of all arrivals in Italy coming from Eastern Africa. And that's Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan, but of course predominantly Eritreans. At the end of 2019, less than 1%. At the height of the crisis, numbers for Eritreans were 30,000, 40,000, around those numbers. And right now, we don't feature anywhere in the top 10 list. If you have a look at the UNHCR portal online, where Eritreans used to be one of the top nationalities, doesn't even really feature in the top 10 anymore. That doesn't really mean that people are not moving from Eritrea or Somalia or Ethiopia heading north, but that then means that something is happening along the way. The countries that they're transiting through, Sudan, Libya, Egypt, we suspect that a lot of people are getting trapped along the way. Particularly for Eritreans, which make up the biggest proportion of people moving on this route from Eastern Africa. There was a surge, for example, when there was a peace agreement signed between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and the end of this decade's end Cold War between the countries came to an end. There was a surge, and almost 70,000 people moved within 2019. That's about 5,000 people a month from Eritrea moving out of the country into neighboring Ethiopia. Of course, there are some people also moving into Sudan. The numbers aren't understood so well there. But figures have also shown, and research has shown, that a large proportion of Eritreans that head into Ethiopia and neighboring Sudan intend to move on from those countries. So that then means that possibly they're getting trapped in detention centers in Libya. Actually, East Africans disproportionately make up the largest proportion of people being held in detention centers in Libya. More than 90% of those being held in detention facilities are from Eastern Africa, and a large proportion of those are from Eritrea. So what is causing all this movement? There are a few words on the screen, and depending on who you talk to and depending on which population groups you're talking to, some of these play a bigger factor than others. This is just to highlight the context in which this movement is happening. As I mentioned at the beginning, a large proportion of those in refugee and asylum seeker flows in the country from South Sudan, where there's an ongoing conflict which doesn't seem to be finding a resolution despite the different negotiations that happen year on year. Ongoing instability in Somalia, which continues to push people out of the country. Endemic poverty and unemployment with a huge youth population who can't find work. Persecution, lack of rights in countries like Eritrea, reports of civil unrest in Ethiopia, drought that affects how people move within the region, and of course some macro macro factors like urbanization and lack of services in big cities. There's some figures coming up on screen right now, which is based on a project that we run across the globe as the MMC network, and one which I manage for East Africa, known as the Forum I project. From that, we're basically interviewing people that are on the move, refugees, migrants, people moving for economic reasons, etc. So the data that you're seeing is based on interviews with more than 2,500 respondents from 2017 to 2019. And what we see is actually most people will not just give one single reason for moving. Around 70% will give more than one reason. So a very small proportion only have one driving factor. So this is based on an analysis of figures on multiple factors. And the three top reasons are economic. Economic meaning employment, people saying that they're not earning enough or not having access to credit to start their businesses or sustain their businesses. A lack of rights, freedom of expression, political persecution or ethnic persecution and discrimination, and violence, whether that be general insecurity, political unrest, or actually outright civil war or conflict that's happening in these countries. When you start to look at the different nationalities, this shifts a little bit. For Eritreans, they might more likely say something to do with lack of rights. For Somalis, they'll mention a combination of economic and violence. Ethiopians would have maybe a combination of economic and lack of rights. So it really depends on which population group you're talking about, but on a top level, these are the key factors. To a lesser extent, things like lack of access to services, personal reasons, environment, etc. So overall, there are a few trends, I think, that we can pull out from what we've been seeing over the data for a couple of years. I think, as I've mentioned severally, the movements are more complex. People are not just moving for one reason, the multiplicity of factors and how they interact, how subjective decisions are made in terms of decision-making. Will I go? Will I not go? Where will I go? What can I access if I get there? More mixed. I think our thinking in the past has been, this is a group of asylum seekers, this is a group of refugees, this is a group of economic migrants. But I think the understanding now is that those delineations are not so clear. More versatile, depending on securitization and how states will treat or respond to movements within the region and also outside the region, that then impacts on how smuggling networks, which are facilitating a lot of this movement, will adapt and shift to be able to continue to move people across borders. Less protected, we collect data also on protection risks and abuses that migrants and refugees face en route. And we're talking here about physical abuse, sexual abuse, lack of food and water, a whole variety of different abuses perpetrated either by smugglers and criminal gangs themselves, but sometimes also, linked to the next point, on corruption and collusion of state officials. I think with everything in mind and the numbers that I presented, we can only see a growth in number in terms of people that are moving. But I would say that a lot of this movement that we're seeing is still within the region, and the outward movement in relation to what's happening in the region is minuscule. And less tolerated, whether that be within the region or countries of transit along the way. We've seen how the EU was trying to channel some money to Sudan to be able to try and contain some of the movement through there, the policies that have been put in place in Libya to try and stop boats leaving there and to keep people within the country and also try and send people back. So I'll end on this last slide, really, and it's more of just, I think, a thinking point about how do we reconcile these different perspectives. I think when we look at migration, we have to look at the whole route. We're talking about countries of origin, countries of transit, and also countries of destination. For countries of origin, I think their focus is pretty much on protection of citizens. They get excited about the fact that there will be remittances and money coming back into the country with a diaspora out there that have a bigger earning capacity. And also, in some way, I think governments might be thinking that, people going abroad is maybe alleviating some pressure that they have on the labor market, which their countries can't respond to. Countries of transit are a little bit of an interesting one. Typically, they don't really have any problem with people moving through, so long as they're, not staying for too long and they don't intend to harm citizens or disrupt what's going on in the country. They get an economy boost, and actually, in countries like Sudan, for example, we know that certain ethnic groups are responsible for some of these smuggling networks, so that churns money within the economy. But countries of transit also now have become very interesting for countries of destination, who now are using them to basically externalize their border policies. In countries of destination, I think the view is quite focused in terms of control. It's really just how do we stop people coming? How do we reduce the numbers? How do we manage this? But I put the last question up there, really, what's the role of all of these countries in terms of protection? As MMC and as DRC, we're a protection looking agency, and for us, really, the abuses that people are facing, the vulnerabilities that people are facing, both in their countries of origin, which lead them to think about migration, or then results in them being forced to move across borders, is key, but also the abuses that they face along the way and the increasing vulnerabilities actually that they have the further away from home that they get, and the policies that are being put in place from European governments, but also African governments who are responding in a way, I think, that's in line with European governments, and how that actually impacts people who are trapped, essentially, along the way, as they can't move past Libya, but they face quite horrific conditions there. So I think I'll put a stop to it there, and then, of course, we can discuss a little bit more thereafter.
Thank you very much, Olivia. We can then still follow up afterwards, and you have been mentioning the different routes to the south and to the north, and also then to the eastern route, which is, as you said, I would say not really very well known in Europe when it comes to migration, because everyone thinks that everyone is heading towards the European Union. I would now like to switch to Alida Vracic. You're welcome. I'm very happy that you are here. Alida Vracic is a political scientist, and she's director of the Popolari Institute in Sarajevo, which is a research center dealing with European integration, politics, good governance, and civil society, especially in the Western Balkan region, so a neighboring region. She's also a visiting fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin, and a non-resident fellow at the Europe's Futures program of the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. Welcome, Alida. Maybe after what you have been hearing there, I mean, she has been talking about the drivers, the push factors. I mean, maybe they might a little bit differ in the Western Balkans. And especially the Western Balkans, I would say we have this narrative of brain drain. Everyone is talking about landscapes where nobody is living anymore, only very old people. And nobody really talks about this other concept, which is of circular migration. And I mean, you're now based in Vienna. You have been based in Berlin. You just have been traveling to the region. You're originally from Bosnia. So this is also part of this other concept of migration. So a rebranding of brain drain and narrative. And I would be interested in how you perceive the situation when it comes to the Western Balkans and European responses, what could be done and what should be done. And yeah, please, the floor is yours. And if you want, you can, of course, also to react of what Olivia has been saying and add to it or compare a little bit the different dynamics there in Eastern Africa and in the Western Balkans.
Okay. This is where it's working. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you actually for having this topic in a very creative way, set up in a very creative way. You know, experiences from different places. I really enjoyed the presentation. But getting back closer to where we're sitting at the moment, there are similarities to what we have heard, but also very much differences with what we have heard about East Africa. In the Western Balkans, as you might know, there's virtually no discussion you can have without mentioning emigration or brain drain or people actually departing from the Western Balkans. Now, it's really, it has become so prominent that I was just telling Gerald, even if you just have a coffee with your friends, you will end up discussing who has left and why can't we have coffee with that person. If you look at the data, we can decide which data we're looking at, because data is also very problematic, and a friend of mine and colleague of mine, Tim Judah, has done quite actually a lot in this respect, trying to demystify numbers a little bit in the Western Balkans, because media doesn't really serve the purpose in this way, because the way it's being presented in the Western Balkans, it's very one-dimensional. People are leaving, we are doomed, no one is going to stay, only old people are there, and this is pretty much the end of the story. If you look at the numbers, they vary between local statistics that you can get at different ministries that only report deregistered people, and deregistered people would be those that actually have decided to take another passport or actually really leave for good, and they have an incentive actually to deregister themselves. The deregistration process is also interesting because you have to pay for it, so people don't actually do it. The second part of the statistic comes from the international circle. So you have Eurostat, you have UN, you have various agencies like IOM, and they all produce their packages of different statistics, what they're looking at and what they're interested in. Now, if we decide that we trust Eurostat, that collects actually information from the ground, only last year we have lost the region as a whole, so we're talking about countries that are still not part of the European Union. The region has lost around 230,000 people. Now, given that countries are relatively small, this is actually quite an important number. The number also becomes important if you go into the reasons why these people are leaving, because the normal conventional wisdom would be, as you have also said in East Africa, poverty, no employment, simply limited opportunities. In the Western Balkans, it has changed over time. In the last couple of years, it has become more about really pessimism. It has become about hopelessness. We can't do anything in these countries. We can't change the system. It's networks of political elites and networks around them are simply so strong that they can't be changed, and this is why we have decided to leave. Corruption really rates quite high. Youth is among those that are actually leaving, but not only, you have entire families leaving, and in their 40s and in their 50s, and this is now becoming a really worrying trend. Also, you can divide the story into people that are young and talented and want to leave and get some experiences abroad. But you can also look at it from another point of view, where you have the immediate damages actually in the region or on the sector. And here I'm talking about medical workers. I'm talking about doctors and nurses and technicians and masseurs and everything and anything that is related to the health industry. Their incentives are really, really quite simple. They want a professional environment. They want better paid jobs. In Germany, they can get a junior position pays like 2,000 euros. And in Pristina, you will get around 600 euros if you're a doctor and 400 if you're a nurse. So they have very, very clear line of chain of thoughts where they sort of heading to. Now, what the Western Balkans governments are doing about this? I think this is really interesting because they're not doing much, actually, at the moment, with an exception of maybe Serbia that has started sort of mapping a little bit what is going on by setting up an agency for circular migration. I couldn't really find evidence in the region that the policymakers are thinking much about this problem. They know it, everyone knows it, everyone sees it, but it's not yet, it didn't enter the policy level that one would expect. It just doesn't really come up in 5 top priorities in these countries. I think this is quite important because you want to use some of that talents and skills that you have. Diaspora in the Western Balkans, conservative assessment is that we have around 6 million people abroad. Now, 6 million people is an army of amazing people that could possibly benefit the region one way or the other. And here I'm not talking about returning necessarily. I'm talking about being in this part of circular migration that we keep on bringing up. And I think it's really important to have a possibility to go back and forth. If you're thinking about European level, you have around 80 million people living outside of their countries in the European Union. If you put them all together, it would be the largest country of the European Union. So why limiting ourselves thinking, okay, once you're gone, that's it, you're gone for good. Less and less immigration is actually permanent. I think this is an important entry point to start even thinking about it. Now, for that to happen, you would have to really think about mechanisms, how one does that. Because if you have Germany, that currently is really benefiting quite a lot from the fact that Western Balkan countries are experiencing this kind of lack of optimism, if you will, and that everyone wants to leave, they gain quite a bit. I mean, if you just think about it very specifically about doctors, there is an estimate that a doctor, to educate one doctor in the Western Balkans, costs around 150,000 euros. If you lose annually 300 doctors, highly qualified ones, that comes up to what, like 50 million. Which country in the region is so rich that it can afford to lose 50 million a year? And what you get in the end is actually a ready-made sort of free product. You get the doctor, you get them through different language courses, and you get a specialist. This is what is happening at the moment. Now, to have that sort of possibility for doctors to get into more professional environment, to get laboratories, to get, you know, special sort of a special education that they would need to progress and excel at their work, is one thing, but how to return some of that benefit in the region would be a challenge. And I think this is a policy challenge. This portability of benefits needs to happen between the region and the countries that are wealthy and powerful in this respect. There are lots of ways how can one go about it, and some creative and maybe less creative, and we don't have to go maybe that far. When it comes to diaspora, we can learn a lot from Ireland. Ireland is an interesting country, and I've done some research there. It has less than 4 million people on the island, but 70 million strong diaspora, 7-0. And depending how you count, and you will have disagreements among Irish how they count diaspora, but it's really, really, really large. So what they've done already in the 60s is that they've, you know, coined and rebranded entirely this concept of diaspora. It's not emigrants, it's not diaspora, it's actually Irish abroad. And this Irish abroad changed also very much the way they started thinking about it. And they started connecting with their diaspora. They started mapping it out. They started, you know, connecting with these people at university level already. If they know that they're going to leave, and they will eventually leave, okay, but tell us about your interests. Tell us about your networks. Tell us about your intentions. Where do you want to go? Irish typically go to England or Australia or some other places. But once there is a possibility back home, maybe you can come back. And many did. But not only, that way also Ireland attracted Romanians, Bulgarians. In the last 5 years, 20,000 Croatians ended up in Dublin, constituting one of the really powerful, actually, diasporas at the moment. Since 2013, when Croatia entered the European Union, 200,000 people left Croatia. So there is another sort of a level that we have to dispel, which is, once we get into the European Union, everything is fixed, no one wants to leave anymore because we will enjoy all the benefits and everyone wants to stay home. Not so much. We have seen it in other countries, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Croatia. That used to be, you know, that we were hoping that it's going to be another role model for the Western Balkans. So there is a quite complex situation at play in the region. There are some really good and positive sort of ways to look at this level of and this trend of immigration, because you really have people, you know, getting to the frontiers where things are happening. If you're sitting in Bosnia and you're dreaming about Google, you want to be somewhere next to Google. You want to learn something about new technologies and artificial intelligence and God knows what. But there are also downsides because we hardly use any of that talent and skills. In the countries of the Western Balkans, nobody speaks about diaspora direct investments. We all keep on talking about foreign direct investments. I think this is also an interesting point. Why don't we talk about something that actually, you know, comes along with the know-how that stays in the region? Diaspora is not only people that could help us. Diaspora is also people that are in need. And this is what Irish really did well. When they started mapping it out, they also reach out to those that are in need. Maybe they're not doing that well in Australia or America or elsewhere, but maybe some of them do. There is a great story about Chuck Feeney, a philanthropist from US who is originally from Ireland, who basically coerced the Irish government into setting up one of the best research institutes in that part of the world. And the way he did it is that he offered a bunch of money, but only if they match it. And because it was done in the public eye, because it was done at the time when Ireland was really facing lots of crisis in the sense of immigration and people leaving, especially young people leaving, they couldn't say no. So they said yes, and they have set up this institute. That's also one way to think about your diaspora, philanthropy. And all these things are you know, possible entry points for us to change the narrative of this depressing story. Everyone is leaving their buses. Like every time you turn on TV, you will see a picture in the news of buses basically leaving nowhere, with never to come back. Other way of thinking about it is to think about, and I think Gerald will touch upon that, and we can discuss it later on, immigration. As we sit here and as we speak here, there are thousands of people stranded anywhere between Croatia and Bosnia and Serbia. And these people are from Syria, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and some other places. You have heard about pushback from Croatia, and you have heard about terrible stories and terrible conditions these people were living in Bosnia until recently, until they put them somewhere else. But I think the time has come also for the Western Balkans to start thinking about maybe attracting some people. Recent data, again, from Eurostat says that there were in 2018 and 19, around 10,000 asylum applications in the Western Balkans. In reality, not many of them want to actually stay. We know that. Let's not fool ourselves. But those who would stay wouldn't have a possibility to do so. And in this way, one again has to be super creative in a policy way to start thinking about countries that have adopted some models where you can integrate people into your labor market. If you're losing people evidently, and there are other people passing through, why don't you sort of match the two in a way? Maybe not giving them citizenship rights or, I don't know, voting rights, but certainly trying to keep some of them, keep young families and try to integrate them into your society. That hasn't even begun. There is no debate about it whatsoever. At the moment, it's pretty hostile, actually, from what I know in Bosnia, but it's not much different from Croatia and some other places. So immigration is a problem. I don't want to understate it, but there are lots of things we haven't even thought about, how to change the narrative and how to enter this debate in a somewhat different, more constructive way, but also think about mechanisms such as circular migration or an immigration in itself. So I will stop here and we can pick up later on and discuss.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alida. I think it's very important also to look at migration from this point of view, that this also means emigration from a country, and also like what the leaders are saying there. And it's quite remarkable that the governments are not really picking that up. And I think this is also a little bit also true for many African countries, that the governments themselves are not really focusing so much on why are our own people leaving. I mean, you should think about this as a leader, so then also the question of leadership could be coming up in this context. But maybe we can talk in a second round
Absolutely.
a little bit about that. Now, last but not least, I would like to introduce, for those of you who don't know him, Gerald Knaus. He's the founder and chairman of the European Stability Initiative, which is a think tank with offices in Berlin, Brussels, and Istanbul, I think. And he has been working extensively on the policy level and especially also on migration. And many of you can probably remember the so-called Merkel plan, which then a little bit different turned out to be the European Union Turkey statement, which came into force, I think, in 2016 it was. But you also have been recently working on a Gambia plan. And my question to you would be, what, on a policy level for Europe, how could this kind of lose-lose situation become a win-win situation for the sending and for the receiving countries? What would be needed? How can cooperation work out? Like, what would be necessary steps? And maybe also another slightly different question, because you have been telling me before that you also have been visiting the camps in Greece, and I think as a European Union we should talk about the situation there in Greece and who is responsible there. I mean, what have you been seeing? Maybe you can also share then a little bit in this, and of course also feel free to comment on what Olivia and on what Alida has been saying, but of course also a very warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this opportunity, for the invitation, for your interest. If they're Irish abroad, and there are also Austrians abroad, and I'm one of them, and I'm always happy to have an opportunity to come back home to talk about an issue that I know is discussed intensively across Europe. I'd very much like to pick up the insistence on facts that Olivia has made in her presentation, how important it is to have a sense of the dimension of the problems, and also this idea of diaspora in need, the fact that when people migrate somewhere, this doesn't actually end the debate what to do, but very often a new debate begins. So trends, facts, and responses, I would like to focus, as I've been asked to, also on ideas of what could be done in terms of policy and a few very concrete things that my colleagues and I are currently working on. Just yesterday I was walking around Berlin with an advisor of the president of the Gambia, a West African country, We were actually meeting some of the Gambian diaspora in one of the famous or infamous parks of Berlin where they were stranded selling drugs. And clearly that advisor, and I'd been in that park with some parliamentarians recently, was quite shocked that in fact this is where people who've gone through hell in Libya ended up. And tomorrow morning I was supposed to meet the Greek Minister of Migration here in Vienna, not his Mitarakis, but he cancelled today because there's turmoil again on the islands. I will not say much about the islands in my short presentation, but we can discuss Greece at length as much as you want. It's something I follow very closely. Let me start, however, with something that, as we all know, is really crucial for these debates on migration, which is the different visions we have. Because while we talk about facts, we also know that most of the debates about migration are not about facts. So what are the glasses and the filters with which people look at migration, connecting Africa and the Balkans? And I would like to present two visions to you, and then some realities. Now, the first vision is dystopia. It's migration as a threat to everything that we hold dear. This book, The Camp of Saints, is a classic since the early 70s among the far right around the world. The vision is of a destruction of Western civilization through mass migration. And it was written by a Frenchman who claimed that he was sitting in the Mediterranean looking across the sea to Africa. And he had this vision of, I quote, the numberless disinherited people of the South who would be like a tidal wave coming across the sea in one big armada to sweep away France and destroy Europe. Now, you might think this is a bit of a crazy vision, except that this is the vision of some of the prime ministers of European Union member states today. Let me quote to you the vision of a speech that this man, Viktor Orban, held in 2018 on the occasion of the Hungarian State of the Nation, where he talked about Hungary as a blessed place. This is how fairy tales begin. A blessed place of peace where everything is going well, where people live happily, they marry, there are tourist facilities, cycle paths, guest houses, and wellness hotels. He then told his audience, his citizens, that we Hungarians have a future as long as we remain Hungarian. If we cultivate our language, defend our Christian and Hungarian culture, and preserve our independence. He then added that the homeland comes before all else, or in an updated version borrowed from the Americans, Hungary first. But then he switched and moved into dystopia. If things continue like this, he told the Hungarians, our culture, our identity, and our nations as we know them will cease to exist. Our worst nightmares will become reality. What is the nightmare? It is that if everything continues this way, the cities of Europe will have a Muslim majority in a very short period. And then London will not be an outlier, but a pioneer. I'm not quite sure what he's referring to. I think it's the fact that London has an immigrant Pakistani origin mayor. I cannot see the political forces, he said, with the will and ability to stop these processes, or let alone horribile dictu reverse them. So he's actually saying, where are the people in Europe who will reverse the ethnic diversity in Europe's big cities? Now, having worked in Sarajevo for many years, I get a bit sensitive when I hear people talk about reversing the presence of minorities. We are not sheep, he told the Hungarians, who quietly stand around waiting for their fate to be visited. Naturally, we shall fight. And if somebody does not refrain from their dangerous plans, we shall simply expel them. So what he said in February 2018 as well is that by 2020 there will be 60 million people coming from Africa. And to stop this ongoing invasion and destruction, what you need is will, force, and allies. Now, Viktor Orban has been looking for allies all around Europe. One of his biggest fans has been Minister of Interior of Italy until recently. And he's also been looking for allies around the world. He was the first Prime Minister of an EU member state who was looking forward already during the campaign to Donald Trump winning the election. And he's looking for an opportunity. His filter, his glasses through which he sees the world, sees an opportunity everywhere. The next big crisis of migration will be the breakthrough for his illiberal coalition. And of course, the next big crisis is going to come, he says, because Europe is led by weak people that keep talking about universal human rights. Will it be Idlib, the 800,000 that are fleeing in desperation towards Turkey, which already has more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees, 4% of the population? Will it be the crisis in the Aegean, where today actually it's 42,000 people who are on the islands, under conditions that a Dutch civil servant who's been working in Pakistan told me don't exist even in the worst camps for Afghans in Pakistan? We have prevented the Muslim world from inundating us from the south, Orban said. We are standing firm. Our defense lines, note he's talking as if this is a military campaign, are sufficient to hold back the flows. And Orthodox Christianity is fighting ahead of us. We acknowledge, and then he lists his allies, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And now we are suddenly in the Balkans, because his vision is in fact that the Balkans is a battlefield. What we see at the Bosnian-Croatian border today, he wants to see everywhere in the Balkans. Hard borders, pushing people back, sending EU border guards to the Balkan countries, trying to harden these borders and trapping anybody who manages to come to Greece somewhere in these Western Balkan states, where then, well, what happens to them? Somehow they should disappear. So this is one vision. Now, let me move to the opposite vision. There's a very nice book I recently came across by an American economist, Open Borders, which actually, amazingly, makes a pretty good case for a radical idea, which is to get rid of all borders. Now you will think, how can that be serious? Obviously, it isn't. But it is still very, very interesting to think this through, because what this man says, Brian Kaplan, is that if we would open all borders, we could eliminate poverty worldwide very quickly. And he's giving all sorts of mathematical models. But the more interesting thing is what he says about the consequences of having hard borders, stopping all forms of legal migration. He calls it global apartheid, the biggest discrimination in the world today, where so much depends on where you are born. Now, between the vision of borders which nobody crosses and which are defense lines armed by arms and a vision of borders disappearing, what's the reality? Where are we today? Well, the reality is that borders exist even between the most friendly democracies. Canada and the US, as you see here. They still have borders. They can't protect them very well because they're pretty long, but they haven't abolished them. In the European Union, it actually took 45 years between the great speech of Robert Schuman and the first meeting in Schengen between a few officials from transport ministries to set up the idea of a borderless Europe among 5 nations. And it took another 10 years to actually implement it. So even in the EU, which has gone the furthest in the world to actually make borders completely invisible, it has taken 55 years. The reality check for legal mobility today, I just checked visas, because in the end, if you want to leave legally, everybody from Africa needs a visa. There is not one country in Africa that can travel visa-free to Europe. 22 million people received a visa in 2017 to the Schengen countries, but 1.6 million was just 3 countries in the north, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. The rest of Africa, all countries except these 3, received only 600,000 visas all year. The reality check, here the interesting thing is for Nigeria, the country of 200 million people, the biggest population in West Africa, is that the number of visas issued has gone down. In 2018, only 40,000 Nigerians received a visa of any kind, tourist or residents. At the same time, irregular migration, these are the numbers of people coming by boat, has been consistently low, with the exception of 3.5 exceptional years between 2014 and 2017, the years we remember when a lot of people crossed from Libya. But every year before, for decades, and of course the last 2 years, the number of people who've crossed from Africa to Italy irregularly has been around 25,000, which is incredibly low for transcontinental migration. And this has been true for decades. If you look at the numbers for Spain, the average has been 15,000 a year. And Spain has enclaves in North Africa. So last year, 40,000 people crossed from all of Africa to the European Union irregularly. 40,000. That is incredibly low, but in fact, that is the average figure for the last few decades. 115,000 was the total number of arrivals in the Mediterranean in 2018, but that includes, of course, Greece as well, and the number in Spain has halved since. The reality check is that irregular migration last year has largely come to a halt. We had 1 Nigerian a day cross the Mediterranean to Europe. Fewer than 50,000, well, 40,000. So what do we do now? What's the policy reality? And I will give you 2 concrete ideas, one for Africa, to reverse this trend, that I've been describing, the trend of actually less and less people moving legally, and one for the Western Balkans for our debate. Yesterday I said I was walking around Berlin with somebody from the Gambia. A year ago, I had not been to the Gambia until a year ago, I met some government officials in Germany, the Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg and his Interior Minister from the Green and the CDU parties. And they told me that in Baden-Württemberg there are 15,000 Gambians. They had come from this small country which is surrounded by Senegal and has 2 million people in West Africa, former British colony, within a few years. In fact, if you look at the numbers, it's quite astonishing. This very small country had 40,000 people arrive in 5 years, which is every 50th person, 2% of the population, left basically in 5 years. About 1,000 people died at sea, which if you put it in an Austrian context would be 5,000 people dying. But very few people have been returned. Why? Because the Gambia doesn't cooperate with deportations. In fact, no country in West Africa does. In fact, almost no country around the world does. But here are the numbers for deportations from the Gambia to Germany. Most people do not get protection because since 2017 the Gambia is a democracy. But here are the numbers, total deportations each year. 144 in 2018, 61 in 2019. Now, with 11,000 people in Baden-Württemberg, we calculated that will take 56 years if it's like 2018, or 97 years if it's like 2019. Clearly that is not a policy. But Austria, among other countries, and Germany, some people in the Ministry of Interior have thought, well, let's just put the squeeze on the Gambia. Let's make them a pilot project for EU pressure. Let's introduce some sanctions. So let's reduce legal mobility even further. Now I should tell you that this is ironic because there is not a single place, a single consulate giving Schengen visas in that country. Anybody who wants to travel and then pays 80 euros has to go to Dakar in Senegal, which is many hours away. So basically nobody travels. Anyway, somebody in the EU thought, and I quote an official who told me this a few weeks ago, we will put the EU's teeth into the Gambia. So we have one of the poorest countries in the world that has been completely isolated after 22 years of dictatorship, has made a peaceful transition to democracy that might be very soon the EU's poster child for putting even more pressure to try to get people to return. The new Schengen Code, which was revised and entered into force this month, gives this opportunity. It will not work, of course. As I was traveling with some MPs from the Gambia 2 weeks ago through Germany, Baden-Württemberg and Berlin, it was striking to see that almost every member of parliament, and indeed the Minister of Youth and the President, have personal experience of irregular migration. The President was deported from Baden-Württemberg a few decades ago. The Minister of Youth has his son in Italy. So we proposed an alternative proposal, and here's a concrete idea, which, if it would work, might be a pilot project to approach Africa differently. We've been telling German MPs and ministries that it is completely unrealistic to expect that you can deport 10,000 Gambians. It would destabilize that country. It would never happen. Regularize all those who are now in Germany and who have not been convicted of crimes. This is the vast majority. But take back everyone. This is the commitment for the Gambians who arrives after an agreed date. Actually, you don't want to take back many people. You want to just give a signal, don't go now. If you don't need protection, and Gambians don't cross the sea. In fact, don't go to Libya. In return for this, offer concrete legal mobility. Triple the number of DRD scholarships, open a consulate, and create some legal work mobility. Now, this plan we've discussed here 2 weeks ago. This is in Stuttgart with the Gambian diaspora. These are MPs and Gambians who've already made it to Germany, and they support it very much. There are discussions at the moment in the Gambian Office of the President. We traveled to Stuttgart, where most of the Gambians are. We met the government, the Minister of Interior, and most importantly, we met the directly elected MPs. This man is from the CDU. He's a former policeman, Federal German Police. He's in the Internal Affairs Committee of the Bundestag, a tough man on migration, and he thinks this plan is brilliant because it could actually work. If we get people into legal work, they will not be in the park selling drugs. They can earn some money. If 5,000 Gambians can send back 300 euros a month to their families, which is what Gambians told me who work in hotels in Baden-Württemberg are expecting to do, that would actually be 18 million a year, which is 4 times the development money currently for youth development of the EU in the Gambia. We discussed with Gambians who'd been sent back from Libya. They are now going around the country and saying, don't go on the back way, don't take this dangerous route to Libya. More than 5,000 have actually come back from Libya and are now warning their countrymen, And of course, this might also be an answer to the biggest tragedy of recent years, the 17,000 people who drowned mainly in the central Mediterranean between 2014 and 2018 in ships like this. For the Balkans, if we would be able to reduce the pressure of irregular migration, there is also an alternative vision, and I'll leave it by this one slide. Instead of hardening the borders between Bosnia and Serbia and North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo, the goal should be to create Swiss borders, to just make them invisible. We know how this works because that's what 5 EU countries started in 1985. We know that this is possible because this is, of course, what existed in the past. It requires cooperation between countries, but it can happen even outside the EU. Remember, Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. And we know what it takes. This was the boat where European countries in 1985, on the river outside the town of Schengen, agreed on the idea of making borders invisible. So no, we will not abolish borders anytime soon. But what we can do is create more mobility, have smarter schemes, make borders less burdensome, and create the people-to-people contact that we keep hearing about from our politicians. Not only in the Balkans, but also between the EU and Africa. All of these, including our Gambia plan and the numbers and sources you find on our website, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this reality check. So the reality lies probably between the dystopia and the utopia, and there are actually possibilities of cooperation, and there could be a better understanding and cooperation within the European Union and African countries, or also Western African countries. Before I go into the discussion, I would very shortly also like to give you the floor if you would like to react to what Gerald has been saying, or also what Alida has been saying, because they raised some different topics, and maybe you would like to react very shortly on some of the ideas.
Yes, I think I'll pick up on 2 points. There was a point made about less migration is permanent. I think we see from the data that we collect on people from the move from East Africa that actually their intentions are not to go to a place largely permanently. People have an objective in mind, a certain amount that they want to send back to their families back home, a project that they want to invest in. They pick a country based on that calculation, based on networks, based on information that they have. They go to that country for a couple of years and then they come back home. So for the large majority of people actually moving on these routes further out of the region, or even within the region, for economic reasons, I think I agree that a lot of this movement is circular and is just to hit a certain objective, and then people go back home. Thank you for the reality check. I think it's very important, and in discourse we're typically presented with these extremes, and you're forced to kind of choose between the dystopia or the utopia, but the truth is always somewhere in between, and actually responding to the situation on ground, I think, just needs a little bit of sobering. There's a little bit of truth in the extreme on the dystopia, there's a little bit of truth in the extreme on the utopia. The three-pronged approach I think you presented there was quite interesting in terms of, one, regularizing people that are already there, because the fact is they can't be sent back home, so let's do something about that and at least fix the situation. Yes, deport. I think states have, and I think we have to recognize this. I think on the utopia side, people are like, oh, but we don't deport people, and they're going back to a country where they fled, or maybe they ran away because they couldn't sustain themselves. But there does have to be a policy in place that allows states to control their borders and allows them to feel like they are in control. Otherwise, what happens then is that they go all the other way and increase securitization. But critically for me, it is really about opening pathways. Particularly for even refugees and asylum seekers within the region, we see that because they're not able to access the full range of protection within the region, then they start looking for other means to move. This isn't to say that everybody that's in a refugee camp then suddenly decides that they will go on a migration journey along one of these routes. But we have seen that, particularly in countries like Kenya, where there's a very strong encampment policy, lack of access to freedom of movement, lack of access to basic services, lack of access to education, refugees can't work, or at least only a very few can actually access work, then that really limits the sustainability of and resilience, I think, of the people that are in these situations. Countries like Uganda have had a policy for a number of years which has been quite successful in terms of integrating refugees into the country, even giving refugees access to land, like to own land, to farm the land, to produce from the land, living side by side with Ugandan nationals. Ethiopia is also making now progressive steps in terms of opening up its refugee policy and allowing Eritrean refugees, which make up one of the largest cohorts, to move outside of the camps to access work and to access services, etc. So I think definitely that there does have to be a balance in terms of allowing states to feel like they're in control and manage their territories. But I don't think we can get away from the fact that movement is happening. It will continue to happen. Conditions in country of origin will change, but it's going to be a long process. It will take time. It's not something that will happen overnight and needs really proper investment and sustainable investment to see change. So a little bit of all three. I was happy to see a well-rounded kind of presentation on that, and I think that would be the way to start discussions with some of the countries in East Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for bringing up also the Uganda case, because I think this is also a very important topic. Many do not know that, especially Uganda and also I think Ethiopia and Somalia are also receiving countries. So they receive many refugees. And in 2015, the biggest migration crisis. I mean, we've been talking about wording, also this negative context when it comes to migration, but it was actually faced by Uganda. And as you said, they give them land. They have been able to move freely to work. So this is also could be a different concept, especially when it comes then to Europe. Alida, would you like to add something on what Gerald Knaus said, or?
Well, actually, I'm very familiar with Gerald's work, so I know the stuff that he has presented. But I think there's a thread between the three of us. It would be an illusion to think that you can stop people from moving. Any trend that we have touched upon here will continue. What the challenge is really to come up with a set of policies that regulate it to some extent. And in the Western Balkans, that means, regulating migration, emigration, people leaving. I mean, you recently had there is a small program called Triple Win in Serbia that is being set up by German development aid and agencies. And the point of the program is really to give people opportunity to leave and to get some education and to get some extra skills, but then to have them return. And it works, but in a very limited way. It's on a very limited scale. And then you have, populists such as President Vučić in Serbia, basically taking it as an argument to say, we will stop this program because we will not let our people all leave because we need them back here. It doesn't happen that way. You have that possibility because people will find a way to actually leave. There is a German law is being changed to a great extent. And on 1st of March, everyone talks about it in the Western Balkans. On 1st of March, basically all conditions or many conditions will be stripped down for people that are willing to actually go to Germany. That means that you can also spend some time without work in Germany and look for a job, because there is a great need for extra people. And I think Germany also learned it in a hard way, because it wasn't as open in the enlargement phases when Romania and Bulgaria were actually becoming full-fledged members of the European Union, and it didn't benefit from it because only a certain number of people came to Germany. But now with this new law, that's gonna relax to a great extent. That law in itself will have more impact on the Western Balkans than any local legislation in place. So we have to think it also that way. And this is why I'm suggesting that we have to start thinking about policies and testing different policies and simply not stating, this is not going to work and we will stop it. It didn't prove to work anywhere, really.
Thank you. And one last question, because I was mentioning it before to Gerald Knaus, about maybe you can share with us a little bit about what is going on in the camps in Greece, and what do you see, what could be done, and who is actually responsible? I mean, what are the main challenges and how could they be overcome? What is your impression?
Well, what we see in Greece now is likely, it could easily become the biggest crisis in the EU again in 2020, because it's clearly completely unsustainable. We have 42,000 people on these islands. Despite the fact that Syrians don't really cross in any significant numbers. 99.5% of Syrians in Turkey last year stayed in Turkey. Why do they stay in Turkey? Because the European Union has mobilized 6 billion euros. And if you go to some of the Istanbul districts, I mean, district sounds quaint, they have 1 million people. You see the huge numbers of Syrians in clinics. You see 680,000 Syrian children in school. So what we have at the moment is actually a situation where the Syrians don't actually move in any large numbers to Greece. I mean, last year, I think 16,000 of 3.6 million crossed to Europe. But despite that, with 60,000 people crossing last year, for Greece, if you add a few 15,000 across the land border, it is approaching the numbers that Austria and Germany experienced in 2015. The asylum system has collapsed. The reception system has collapsed. Greece alone will not be able to solve this. So what is to be done? I mean, this is the German, the Austrian, the Danish external, I mean, not Denmark, they're not in Schengen, but they are in Schengen, of course, the Danish external border. We need to be able, with those numbers of people arriving, and it was very few people the last 3 years. In 2017, in the first half of the year, it was 9,000 people in 6 months. And yet, even then, the conditions in the camps, and I visited Moria and Lesbos, on Lesbos then, were terrible. We need to be able to do the 3 things that were agreed between Turkey and the EU, which is offer people who need protection a chance to come from Turkey directly to the European Union. This was point 5 of the agreement. It was reached, it was proposed by the Turks in March 2016, the EU committed to it. It is doing very little of this. Second, continue to support the refugees who are now in Turkey. 4% of the population, refugees in Turkey. If the European Union would take 4% of its population as refugees, all the refugees of the world would be in the European Union. So this is an enormous pressure, and it's increasing every year just through births by 100,000, and we might have a few 100,000 coming from Idlib. So this is an enormous challenge. We need to continue to support these refugees financially. It's not yet decided. We don't know. Perhaps some governments might decide, let's not. Why should we pay? And of course on the Greek islands, have the ability, those 40,000 people are now on the islands. I mean, it's clear, and I tell the Greeks, and we've wrote a paper on this recently, I tell Greek officials, it is clear you will not be able to process them. You will have to move them off the islands. But if you just move them off the islands now and do nothing else, you'll have 40,000 come to the islands in the next 2 months. So what you need is you need to move people off the islands to the mainland under decent conditions, but you need to then be able to process applications quickly. To be able to decide to send those Syrians who come, who are 90% safe in Turkey, back to Turkey, where there are 3 million of them, and to be able to decide that those who do not need protection in Europe, which is 50% of the others, if you look at the statistics, are not getting into boats coming to Greece. And in return, Europe should offer Greece to keep restoring relocation, because you cannot have a country where at the moment almost 100,000 people are in the asylum procedure, waiting for it to be processed, and people keep arriving. Greece will not be able to sustain this. If we don't do this, and at the moment I'm worried that the European Union will not do much, and member states will not do much, we will have the collapse of the system in Greece. We might have, as spring comes again, 10,000 or 15,000 a month arrive on the islands. We'll have massive crisis in the Balkans, as these people, of course, will keep leaving Greece, and Greece has zero incentive to try to stop them on the mainland. And the scenes that we see on the Croatian-Bosnian border will look very mild compared to what we might expect. And then we will have Viktor Orban triumphant, saying, I always knew it, the only way we can sort out this problem is to be more brutal. Send soldiers, not border guards. That's what he keeps saying. He doesn't like Frontex. He says, we don't need Frontex, we need soldiers. Build fences that people can't cross. Build fences across the Balkans. And if moderate politicians, or those who care about the right of refugees, don't have proposals that they can prove, that they can implement, in the end, the Salvinis and Orbans will win the argument. And that might be the end of the Refugee Convention. If we return in Europe, at a time when we have Trump in the US, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Putin in Russia, if we in Europe too turn away from the idea of the Refugee Convention that was signed in 1951 in Geneva, nothing is left. then we'll have, of course, refugees still, but if Europe says we don't have any obligation, we can send them back without checking whether they need protection, who else are we going to preach that this is important? So a lot depends on this, and 2020 will be a decisive year.
Thank you very much for this not so positive outlook. So we hope we can still do something about it and really convince the people, not only winning the argument, but also convincing them that we can actually do something. I would say now we can go into the discussion. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and please also indicate to whom you are posing the question. If it's a specific one, we have one question over there, and then one there in the middle, and there in the back. And then we take a fourth one here, and then we can have a second round.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. My name is Marija Petrovic. I'm actually one of these Bosnian brain drainers who left 10 years ago. I spent 5 years in London and now 5 years in Vienna. And actually the question goes to Gerald. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain and elaborate a little bit more on this proposal for no borders, no borders in the region, I guess. Because I think what is not necessarily so immediately obvious to me, and that's why I would love if you could elaborate a little bit on this, is when I look at the countries like Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and so on, people are really trying to leave and go into the EU. So I just wonder, what would we be solving by opening the borders within the region, and maybe you could quantify that impact a little bit? Thank you.
Thank you. There in the back, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's not.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. My question goes to Gerald Knaus, and I'd like to know, because you said it is very important that the EU countries stick to the international convention. What role do claims for international protection play in the Gambia plan?
Then, yeah.
Thank you for the presentations. Walter Wolf from European Commission official. Question to Gerald. Without any doubts, you and your organization need any support for the initiative for the Turkey deal. But remembering that it was not the European Union.
Can you speak up a little bit?
It was not the European Union, it was the deal between Erdogan and Merkel who made things happen. And as long as states are depending on leaders like you said, Orban and others, probably the majority of member states have leadership with similar tendencies. It's hard to see how you can convince them to come to a larger agreement between the European Union and the accommodation of refugees in the European context. So as long as I'm pretty sure you will win the next elections, it's hard to convince those who are in power. Alida, you made two interesting points. The one was about the doctors financed by the local governments or by the governments in the Western Balkans moving to the richer member states. Austria gets some students from Germany to become doctors, and the Austrian government asked the Germans to pay for their studies. Would this not be a point to be raised, that there would be a transfer to compensate the poorer countries sending the medical personnel? And the other point is about, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are some facilities in place from Germany to get care workers trained in Bosnia. Not just language training, but also training which prepares them for working in Germany. Would this not be in the sense of diaspora, model which could be implemented on a larger scale, which makes a win-win situation between the two. Last point to our leader, diaspora is important. But as long as you treat the diaspora as the Austrians, for example, the Turkish diaspora in Austria, saying, you have to behave as Austrians, don't forget anything about your Turkish origin, it's hard to have any credibility in dealing with, in a consistent way with the diaspora in a country if they are encouraged every day to forget about their origin. Thanks.
And in front of you, you're directly in front.
Thank you. My name is Kamal. I am a researcher in the field of corruption and money laundering, and therefore I miss the reference between the nexus between corruption and immigration. And this is not only homemade corruption, it's a corruption encouraged, facilitated by some European countries and United States. I here mention Iraq, for example, Afghanistan, and before Libya, Tunisia, where the embezzled monies are transferred with the help of foreign banks, European, American banks, to these countries and being laundered. These countries are the main sources, the main origins of immigration now, and therefore the destination countries, Germany, for example, Switzerland, United States, United Kingdom, and even Austria, bear partially their responsibility for the immigration, and therefore they have the obligation to take them because they are one of the main reasons of the migration. Thank you.
And one last one for now.
Thank you. My question goes to Olivia. Could you a bit compare the migration East Africa and West Africa? What are the differences? As far as I have the numbers in my mind, there are many more migrants from refugees, or let's say migrants from West Africa. Maybe countries are bigger, maybe there are more crises, but anyway, could you a bit, if you have some resources, compare East African and West African migration?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Maybe.
Okay. Well, quickly on our proposal for Swiss borders. What do we mean by Swiss borders? I've just recently been in Basel at, you have these pedestrian bridges into France, a new bridge. There's no control and hasn't been for a long time. And into Switzerland, where you only have customs controls, but people are not controlled when they cross. Switzerland is not in the European Union. So obviously, why did the Swiss decide to vote for it in a referendum? It's not a country that easily gives up its sovereignty. It has a very strong populist party, the SVP, which was strongly against this. Why was there such a clear vote in Switzerland to just get rid of border controls? And during the whole refugee crisis, this was not questioned. Because it made sense for the Swiss. This was a very pragmatic debate. The government won, the police was all in favor, the police trade unions, all the cantons, and in the end, a clear majority. Why? Because when you have controls, you can anyways, as the Swiss pointed out, control only a very small part of the cars so people cross. 2% used to be controlled when Switzerland was not part of Schengen. At the same time, cooperation with neighboring countries helps you when you deal with really serious crime. The benefits for citizens are obvious, but the Swiss also argued it's good for security. So when we saw this, and of course you have a similar situation between Norway and Sweden, which is also not in the EU, and then we saw the debate in the Balkans in the last 2 years on changing borders. Suddenly we had this very dangerous idea again of redrawing boundaries, discussions the Americans in particular are pushing. We thought, well, if we would have invisible borders, let's say between Bosnia and Serbia and between Kosovo and Serbia, or between Kosovo and Albania, if people would cross in the way they can cross inside Schengen, where we have 16,000 kilometers of invisible borders today, then also for minorities which live on different sides of these states, and a lot of them do. Albanians live all over the region, Serbs live all over the region, Bosniaks live all over the region. The idea that you can just move as a citizen without concern, which of course used to be the reality a few decades ago, becomes normal. It's a very concrete vision. It requires cooperation. I mean, we know what cooperation, because Schengen We did it. You know, these countries need to agree, for example, on extradition. You can't have criminals just escape across an open border. So this is hard. You imagine these talks between Kosovo and Serbia. But it's actually in the interest of Serbs in North Kosovo not to have this border visible. So it might be interesting to Belgrade. You have to agree on a common visa list. But it's not that much you need to agree on. The problem is right now the EU is pushing, some in the EU are pushing in the opposite direction, and of course some member states like Hungary. They want the borders in the Balkans between the countries to be as hard as possible to trap migrants. And this is not in the interest of Bosnians, or Serbs, or North Macedonians. So it's mainly this. It's not so much about economic benefits. It's not about trade. I mean, trade, the easier it is, the better. But as you know, Schengen is about people moving. But I think it would be good for the Balkans. Now, on the international conventions, well, the Gambia plan has to respect this. The idea is still, if people arrive in Italy from Libya and apply for asylum, you have to have an asylum procedure. The challenge for us is to be able to make these decisions quicker than 4 years, which has been what it took in Italy. For a final decision on asylum in Italy in 2016, it was 4 years. This is crazy. Then you don't need an asylum system at all. Now, with the current numbers, and I was just visiting the BAMF, the German asylum agency in Nuremberg, which is not the biggest asylum agency in the world. They had 250 caseworkers for asylum cases in 2015. They have 1,800 now, permanent positions to decide asylum cases. It's crazy that they all sit in Nuremberg, when in fact we have the pressure now in Greece. What we need to find is coalitions of countries that pragmatically sit together and work out how, in their own interest, like the countries that set up Schengen, not waiting for the veto of Mr. Orban or Mr. Kaczynski or others who don't care about solving the problem. Get ahead, sit down with Athens and say, listen, how do we make an agreement that is in mutual interest? We need to be able to have quick and fast decisions. And we need the same, of course, in the central Mediterranean. And I can talk a lot more about this. You're right on the EU-Turkish statement. That was, of course, a Turkish initiative. I mean, we wrote this paper in September 2015, and it was picked up by the Germans, but they didn't really move. It was then picked up by the Dutch government, Mr. Rutte, who read our report, and he said, this is what we will do when we have the presidency. But in the end, the key was the Turks. They read our paper, and they then proposed to Mr. Rutte and to Chancellor Merkel in the Turkish embassy in Brussels on the 7th of March 2016, that as their plan. And this is why it works. What we need is that Greece presents to the Germans a plan that says, here is what we need from you, and then Germany is ready to help. That Gambia goes to the EU and says, this is what we want. It must be realistic, must be give and take, win-win, but then there's a chance of it being implemented. So you're completely right. At the moment, if we have discussions at the level of 27 EU members, I fear very little will happen. Too many countries don't care. They don't need a solution. They like the crisis. They build their careers on it. Last point on corruption, just one word on the Gambia. That's true, of course. We had 22 years, one-man rule in the Gambia. When this man was forced to step down peacefully, it was great, early 2017, the country was bankrupt. All the billions were stolen. You know, this is the kind of corruption that drove young Gambians in the 4 years before out of the country.
Sorry, and where is the money?
Well, there's a lot to be said, and this is a different topic. There's a lot to be said about the collusion of Western interests with money laundering from Moldova and Russia to South America and Africa. And one result is, of course, that young people in the Gambia, at the end of this dictatorship, the last few years, just said, it's hopeless, I risk slavery in Libya to get to Europe.
Would you like maybe to add maybe also on the East and West Africa comparison is still open, and then also maybe on the corruption and migration? The next issue.
Yes, maybe I'll start with the corruption and collusion and migration. Yes, I alluded to it because it's something that we inquire into as part of the Forum I program in terms of how much is movement facilitated or how much of a blind eye is turned to people that are moving across borders. We're talking about huge numbers of people moving, which must be within the knowledge of government officials. Of course, there is reports on, crackdowns and trying to stop people moving, detentions, and so on and so forth. But in our survey, we actually asked respondents about, do they have to pay bribes to cross borders? Did they have to pay bribes so that their documents would, be passed and would qualify? Or Did they have to falsify documents and use those to be able to navigate? What we see is that quite a significant proportion of people on the move within the region and also from the region would pay bribes, would engage government officials in that way. And then that then leads us to ask how widespread is that? Is it a one-on-one situation with a few border guards on this particular crossing point, or is it more of an institutional operation? I think it's something that we try to bring up as we can, depending on the conversation and the room that we're in, and also the appetite for the people in the room, whether they really want to hear this, with donors, with government officials, in whatever forum we're in. I think there's definitely a link. The extent and the amount of money that we're talking about when we talk about some smuggling networks and criminal gangs that are operating within people movement is too large to be unknown. But the extent to which that is more at a lower level or more institutional, I think is still needs to be understood.
And on the east and west?
Yes, on the east and west, it's an interesting thing, because when we looked at when we were tracking numbers for our purposes in terms of East Africans arriving in Europe, 2015, 2016, 2017, we started to notice a shift at some point where East Africans were ranking very highly. As I said, in that top 10 list on UNHCR's data portal, it was always Eritreans somewhere in the top 2, Somalis somewhere in the middle, 4, 5, along with Sudanese and Ethiopians somewhere a little bit towards the bottom, but consistently, month on month, we would look at these figures month on month, and those nationalities would feature quite highly. At some point, I think during, towards the end of 2016, early 2017, we started to see that a lot of West African nationalities were climbing up on the list, and actually, if you like, displacing East Africans' positions up there. Not to say that the East African numbers were going down, but actually there was this rapid climb of Nigerians and Gambians, Somalians coming from West Africa and the Sahel into Europe. I think if we look at why that is a factor, why that was happening, I think we have to understand that the migration that's happening in West Africa is being driven by something quite different that's happening in East Africa. In East Africa, when we look at migration, as I mentioned, it's really quite complex. We're talking about years of conflict and instability, poor governance, poverty. Of course, some of these factors are also present within West Africa, but I think in terms of even how refugees, migrants have been received from Eritrea, from Somalia for decades in Europe. The acceptance rates in terms of refugee claims that have been made was quite high for these nationalities. So even in terms of how Europeans viewed East Africans versus West Africans were perceived as just people coming across for jobs, purely economic. And with East Africa, there was some kind of nuanced understanding that there were these other factors at play. So I would say, on the face of it, I think we're talking about not to say that the West African is less complex. Of course, there are different factors to be understood within that dynamic. But for East Africa, I think the perception has been quite different. Also, when we look at free movement within West Africa versus East Africa is quite restricted. There are moves trying to be made in terms of the East African community. We're trying to get towards free movement of people and then eventually trade in goods. The IGAD bloc, which is a regional economic bloc within the Horn and East of Africa, is trying to also make moves towards opening up some of the borders within the country for this. West Africa has already had a free movement, free trade policy in place for a number of years, which is quite different from East Africa. So again, those dynamics are slightly different. The securitization of movement within East Africa, also because of fears of terrorism from Al-Shabaab in Somalia, can kind of make you understand why countries like Kenya fixate on this idea of encampment, and they don't really want Somali refugees to move a little bit further because they have this inherent fear that if they do allow Somalis to move freely within the region, then of course that also means that Al-Shabaab terrorist operatives would also move within that undetected. So I think that there is a little bit of a difference, but as I said, with the East Africans, a lot of them are getting trapped along the way, in Sudan, being pushed back at that point, or also in Libya, highly disproportionately represented in detention facilities almost entirely.
Thank you. And Alida, one question was directed to you, but you can also elaborate on the other ones.
Yes. I find this idea on Swiss borders really appealing, and I was just thinking that actually in Bosnia we actually have it in a way. We exercise it to some extent because you can really, like on any given day, go from one entity to the other without even noticing, unless you're really paying attention to the flags at the entry points. But you would have this kind of thing. I'm not sure what incentives would the region have at the moment, because I just returned from the region, and if anything, borders are being strengthened, and there is this discussion about security being pushed towards the borders even more, especially from the Croatian side. But I think it would make sense, and it would give it would ease in a way relax the situation in the Western Balkans. As for the doctors, if I understood right, Austrians are training German doctors but getting money for it. Wanting to get money for it. Yes, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. But I mean, it's what you have mentioned, it does exist to some extent. There are training programs, but there are also language centers, and they're mushrooming. This is another industry that has really resurfaced in the countries on the Western Balkans. If you go to any portal in the Western Balkans, you will find an advertisement that is being sponsored all the time, says "Made in Germany." And you click on it, and you get a bunch of different possibilities. And you get, from language centers in Mostar to, I don't know, some training courses elsewhere, with one sole purpose of getting people to Germany. Now, the point is how to also get them back in some shape and form. And for that, you would have to have a large scale, like European mobility, if you will, that is going to reflect also on the Western Balkans. One thing that we have discussed is this concept of basically, once getting into the European Union, that would be, portability of benefits would be clear, but because Western Balkans is nowhere near, one would have to come up with a way to scale up some of the specialized institutions, some of the, having clarity and transparency about benefits that people can have in terms of pension system, social system, in order to go back and forth. At the moment, it doesn't really happen because they just leave and they normally stay, like 90% of them stay. So this is not the thing. As for diaspora, I mean, the diaspora is interesting because it's, we actually don't know much about our diaspora. There are ongoing discussions at the moment, but only in infancy phase, how much academics we have out there, what they do, what are the research topics they're dealing with, how many engineers, how many IT experts, how many doctors, how many this and that. In order to actually seriously discuss diaspora, one would have to map it up. One would really have to know what we're talking about here in terms of numbers, in terms of their skills, in terms of their connections, in terms of their placements, and then start thinking about how to connect with this. I wouldn't underestimate the potential of diaspora, because people that have left the region, every morning they open up first like portals in their own language, and they read the news, and sometimes even know the news even before the people that are living in the country, because they live in a different zone. They're angry at their politicians, they're angry at their governments, but they're not angry at their friends and their families. And that should be, I think, capitalized in some way. And at the moment, it is not happening. And of course, it's challenging. And on one hand, as a politician in the Western Balkans, you lose people. You're aware that you're losing people. But those you would want to attract would actually challenge you in many different ways. So it's a very tricky formula also for the political elites in the Western Balkans.
Thank you. If somebody has still an urgent question, there are still two. Okay, we have one there. He was already before. Sorry, I cannot take all. And there on the. And then we take the one there in the back. And I think with three we have to leave it. I'm very sorry, but time is already.
Congratulations to the proposals of Mr. Knaus, and I hope he can succeed. The only thing. Blaming Orban is easy for us, but there's not much difference to our Chancellor. And a question I couldn't get answered regarding the budget discussion of the EU. on Tuesday there was a discussion about it in the European House. How much money is dedicated of the European budget to help of refugees or aid for the originating countries? Because yesterday you might have heard that our Chancellor said we pay a lot to the European budget, which goes to the migration service. Do you have any figure on that?
Thank you. And there, yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to Olivia, because I was wondering why you keep calling the facilitators smugglers. You know that, especially on the East African route, we have the largest trafficking business worldwide. And just for you to know what happens, you know, people travel relatively cheaply or without paying all the way to Libya, and the moment they're in Libya, they're taken, held for ransom, they're being beaten up, videos are being shot and sent to the families. If you look at Facebook in Tigrinya or Somali, you see these films where families send around videos of people being tortured and say, please help me collect the money, $5,000 or whatever dollars, usually between $5,000-$7,000. It gets more expensive when one group sells on these people to the next group, and the ransom rises. And I've only recently interviewed people who have come to that route, and they then say, I couldn't pay, I don't have a family to pay, so I was sold to a person, and they actually say, I worked for my owner for I don't know how many years until I had paid off. So this is a multi-billion-dollar business that's happening there. In the Balkans, we also see now a change from smuggling, which is like a voluntary cooperation, to trafficking. So people, and you see them with the naked eye, you walk through the camps in Montenegro and in Bosnia, you see them with the naked eye. They go there and they say, if you can't pay now, because people are depleted of their funds, if you can't pay now, I'll help you to get somewhere in Western Europe, and then you will pay that off. So we are looking at bonded labor here, and I wonder why this one aspect is not really part of the migration debate. And I would just like to thank Gerald Knaus for what he said, because what we see now in the migration debate is that it's not the European migration debate, be it from the utopian or from the dystopian side, is not there to solve problems. They always speak to their own constituency, but and we have like an old couple discussing, exchanging the same arguments year after year and not leading to solution. So I'm happy that you are trying to initiate a fact-based discourse here.
Thank you. And the last question there, way in the back. Yes. And then I would like you to answer quickly and also give your last statement on the topic if you prefer.
Thank you. Can you hear me? My name is Jan Malekzadeh. I work for the United Nations, but I'm here in my private capacity. I'm actually visiting my children who are in school in Vienna. And I would like to share a few observations since I've been working the last 9 years in the Western Balkans about Gerald's plan. The role of the European states with regard to the different states in the Balkans is more than problematic, I would say even divisive. And I can give you 2 examples which are quite obvious. Kosovo is not a member of the United Nations. It's not universally recognized as a state. It's recognized by a certain number of states. 5 states of the 27 European states do not recognize it as a country. This encourages, of course, Serbia to increase its efforts of pressuring derecognition of Kosovo. This encourages separation. This does not encourage them to cooperate on a joint border. Second example, one of the few positive developments we've seen over the last years in the Western Balkans was North Macedonia. North Macedonia managed to settle its conflict with Greece. Largely a symbolic conflict about identity, nationalism, and covering a dysfunctional government in North Macedonia, which was in the end, anonymously by the United States and by the European Union, accused of massive corruption, massive violation of human rights. This government has been ousted, and since a year and a half, Macedonia managed to restart the dialogue with the European Union, restart a dialogue with NATO, and become sort of get a few steps closer to integration. Maybe I have to tell a little bit more about it. It was the European Union and the Americans together who asked the government to institute a special prosecutor on corruption. Special prosecutor on corruption in Skopje accused the former prime minister of systematic corruption. Where is this man now? Well, probably you know. He's a political refugee. Guess where? In Hungary. Political refugee in Orban's Hungary. I leave it to you to judge how this should contribute to the rule of law in Macedonia. So there are cases to be made about Albania, Montenegro, and other countries in the Western Balkans, that the role of European Union states is actually a divisive one, not one that would bring them together. And that makes me rather pessimistic about the prospects of having an area where you do not have any border controls anymore. Because at the moment we see the opposite. Kosovo has 100% tax on every good coming from Serbia. Albania and Kosovo seem to be finding more common terms on economic exchange, but it is, in terms of the numbers, not relevant. So I just wanted to share this observations. It's my personal view, it's not the United Nations view, yeah?
Thank you very much. So maybe we start from left to right.
I mean, I agree with you that EU policy in this respect, I mean, you brought up a case of North Macedonia that we all know well, that after so many years, an agreement has been reached and everyone expected this is going to be a game changer, if you will, in the region. But then we didn't really have EU's response on it the way we have expected, and we still don't know actually what's going on with some other countries and how they progress and excel towards the EU. And tomorrow's debate is going to be about EU enlargement, and Gerald and myself will be also again on the same panel, but this is going to be part of the discussion. I think it's a super important discussion, and I agree with you. It's more divisive than it should be, and it shouldn't be that way. And we should really, like in 2020, we should have been discussing different matters, if you will, like more advanced matters than those that we're discussing at the moment. And I don't know. As for the other questions, I think they have been specifically referred to the trafficking. I'm aware that this is ongoing, but again, I haven't done any research on it, and I'm sure there are horrific stories to be told also from the Western Balkans, not to speak about other zones that we have discussed tonight. Again, there is very little. I mean, at the moment, this is very hostile. Also, from a Bosnian case, I can tell you that debate is these people should be gone, and we don't care how, and everyone expects, in 2 months' time, spring will come and these people will be gone. While we have heard that this might not be the case, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there was the question about the budget, I think, still.
Yes. Well, I mean, just to say that on the cruelty, I completely agree, and I've talked to many Gambians who've been in Libya, and the stories they are telling are just horrific. I mean, these smugglers, nobody can have any romantic idea about them. They are brutal, they kill people. I talked to a young teacher who left the Gambia, went to Niger, Agadez, and then already when they were 50 on a truck crossing the Sahara, he said immediately the people, the traffickers, they killed 2 people just to assert the authority. People dropped off the bus in the Sahara, they left them to die. I mean, 8 people died on that trip that he was on just to get to Libya. Then he was taken as a slave, effectively, for a few months. He was in prison. I mean, he left in 2014, and he arrived in Italy in late 2015. So these stories, I completely agree. This is anything one can do to stop people even going to Libya with humane methods while preserving the right to asylum is a good thing. it is the right thing not to encourage people to go to Libya because things are horrific. It's good that now young Gambians and young West Africans are doing this. They are actually going around villages and telling their countrymen and women, don't do that. You were right, it's easy, of course, to pick Orban. It's just that Orban makes these wonderfully clear speeches. I mean, what I find amazing about Orban is he's been telling us for years that, I mean, another quote, which is very striking in that same speech, is where he says, the threat comes from Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, not from the south. You know, he is working very hard with the most anti-EU parties. He's meeting with them. He coordinates, and the end product, if he succeeds, will be, I fear, and I don't think he intends this, a dramatic crisis in the European Union, because Swedes and Dutch and I think Germans and French will not want to be in the illiberal European Union that he is envisaging. We already have Poland. I mean, this is a different issue, but I think he is the most dangerous man in the EU today because he's so strategic. He builds alliances. He's very good at waiting. He doesn't attack Angela Merkel until he thinks she's about to fall. Then he attacks her, like in June 2018. But you're right, there are Austrian politicians who speak like him. Austria didn't behave like Hungary. I mean, this is a major difference, but there are politicians who speak like him, and I think they underestimate, and I include our Chancellor, the threat to vital Austrian interests. If this kind of politics, which uses the refugee issue for different ends. You know, there have been no asylum seekers in Hungary in the last 4 years. The year when he talked about the mass invasion, 800 people applied for asylum in Hungary. You know, it's a complete myth, but it's used for another tool, which is to create basically semi-authoritarian governments inside the European Union. And a lot of countries don't want to solve problems. You're completely right. I think that is part of the problem. This is why we need coalitions to move ahead based on their own interest, and Schengen is a good story. I think we shouldn't have any illusions. Also now, in March, there will be no EU proposal coming from the Commission that can be adopted by the Member States. It will not happen. I was just in Sweden talking to people in the Ministry of Justice last week, and I'm talking a lot to the Dutch and to the French Ministry of Interior. I mean, they're all actually pretty clear. They don't expect any EU-wide solution to be adopted. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't act. And I would hope that Austria would be constructive enough and be part of that coalition with the Benelux, with the Nordics, with Germany, with Portugal, with Finland, and a few others that want humane solutions to preserve the conventions we've ratified decades ago and have control. And last point, if you're interested in the issue of what the future of the Balkans is, not migration, Alida and myself will be tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the House of the European Union, or Haus der Europäischen Kommission oder Europäischen Union in der Wipplingstraße at 5 o'clock, and we'll be discussing with Martin Sedlmayr, who of course has been Chief of Staff of Jean-Claude Juncker, about how the EU is dropping the ball in the Balkans and what should be done. But that's a different issue.
Thank you. And Olivia?
Yes, certainly. I completely echo your sentiments. I think my careful choice in language might be with my legal background and trying to make sure that the distinctions, at least legally, in terms of what is smuggling and what is trafficking are quite distinct. But of course, on ground, we see that the blurring of these two phenomena is clouds what actually happens on ground. We have situations of pure smuggling, facilitation, paying for a service and receiving that service transport from A to B. We have somewhere in the middle where there's an exacerbated instances of violence, which maybe don't go as far as crossing into the definition of trafficking, but definitely people are being put at risk. And then we have outright, complete human trafficking. You're absolutely right. This is something that we're seeing not just even on the route that goes through Libya, but also in Yemen. Ethiopian arrivals that have land on the shore of Yemen and hoping to transit through immediately get kidnapped and held in dens for weeks to be extorted. This is also something we've seen historically with Eritreans when the route through Egypt to Israel was still open, and in the Sinai and kidnapped there, and you know, massive demands in terms of money, $5,000-10,000 upwards, which of course puts a massive strain on economies back home and communities back home who then have to try and somehow gather this money together to let people set free. And of course, depending on what kind of situation people find themselves in, this can be repeated many times along the journey, and there are reports of people on the route through Libya mentioning that they have been held several times by different groups for being extorted for ransom. So I think I definitely would concur with the points that you made there. I think then that leaves us to say then there's an obligation on states who are very aware that this is happening within their territories to crack down on this. I think there's not been enough advocacy and pushing on states to really focus, aside from the numbers that are moving through. I think that's where all the attention is, but really to look at these human rights atrocities that are being perpetrated against people in their territory, and because they're in their territory, whom they have an obligation over. So I think definitely something that we need to continue talking about and drawing attention to until somebody does something about it.
Thank you very much. I think with this we can then slowly close. I think I hope you enjoyed the evening. I hope you learned something. I hope we could give you an idea about the complexity of migration, and it is complex. It depends on regions, different reasons, different regions. And I really think it was very, very interesting to have these different views. I mean, Western Balkans, Eastern Africa, policy level. So thank you very much for your excellent and ideas and to share it with us. And I would say we should give our panelists a big hand. Thank you.
Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.